On August the 6th, 1901, Ernest Shackleton, Robert Falcon Scott, and 45 others set off from England on an epic journey to the Antarctic. That expedition lasted 3 years. It was the first of over a decade and a half of expeditions that led to these two men being heralded as legends of what is now known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. While they were on the ice, they built huts that they lived in for months on end, through sunless winters and nightless summers. They have remained virtually uninhabited and untouched since Shackleton's transantarctic expedition in 1917. The huts are time capsules of the men's lives on the ice. Over a century later, in 2008, I was given the extraordinary opportunity of photographing these huts. This is what I'd like to share with you. Even on an overcast day, Antarctica in midsummer is a bright and shadowless place. When I disembarked from the plane onto the ice, the first things that struck me were the glare off the snow and the vastness of the landscape. My preferred photography conditions are soft, low light. The huts, by contrast, were dark and oppressive. I knew how I wanted to approach the assignment, but was dismayed at how difficult it was going to be. My technique is to use long exposures, multiple frames per image, and a lot of macro work. My end goal was to photograph the huts in more detail than the human eye could see. I was apprehensive that this might not be achievable, as the lighting conditions inside the huts were either very dark or lit by brilliant stripes of window light. I realised that each section of the huts would have to be lit separately by bouncing in available light. I felt completely overwhelmed by the enormity of the task. To accomplish what I had proposed would require mind-numbing hours over 10 days. For what seemed like an eternity, I stood behind my camera, mounted on a pivot head tripod, and meticulously moved around the walls, metre by metre, recording each section of the 3 huts. These images were later stitched together to make a whole. Discovery was the hut built by the first expedition in 1901 and used by all subsequent parties. It is also the most desolate. Its design was so unsuited to the Antarctic conditions that the men preferred to sleep on their ship rather than stay in the hut. By 1916, the last time the hut was used, snow had pushed through an opening and the interior had filled with ice. Stranded, the men had to hack into this ice to form a shelter. There they remained for 2 months on a diet of seal meat. They had no idea that hidden in the ice, only metres away, were tins of biscuits and food. The food is still there, and so are the scrim and sacking-covered dividers they used to make their sanctum, stained with the dark, greasy soot from the seal blubber stove, and marking the tiny area of their refuge within the much larger hut. The beauty of these raw wooden walls and hand-stitched padding meant that this became my favourite hut. Shackleton's Hut was built in 1908 at Cape Royds, and it could not be more different to Discovery. It's neither foreboding nor filled with an atmosphere of tragedy. When you walk into this hut, you feel that you could put down your knapsack, lay down your sleeping bag, and comfortably live there. That's how utterly charming and hospitable it feels. Supplies of coal and gas meant that blubber wasn't burned here, so the interior of this wooden hut glows. Cape Royds is the home of the southernmost colony of Adelie penguins. In summer, surrounded by them with shafts of light falling through the north-facing windows, it's an uplifting place to be. The last hut was built in 1911 at Cape Evans. It belonged to Scott. I remember walking through the door of Scott's hut for the first time. Its sense of history is overwhelming. Sir David Attenborough called it a time warp without parallel. It felt like nothing had changed. It was airy, beautiful, and moving. A spiritual place. The heavy wooden door with its leather straps was familiar from many photographs, but the overpowering smell of blubber and hay was unexpected. Inside were hundreds upon hundreds of everyday objects from Edwardian Britain. While the building itself was impressive, the layers of detail that began to emerge from these objects captured my imagination. The longer I spent in the hut surrounded by the items the explorers had left behind, the more they became the focus of my photography. There were roughly darned socks and handmade boots stuffed with straw, personal items left behind, combs, cufflinks, dress shoes. I had a lot of time to wonder why these items had been chosen as necessities for the trip. What could they possibly need dress shoes for? It seemed incredibly poignant that the reality of life on the ice would be so different from that imagined in England. These items just reinforced the difference between a somewhat romantic expectation and the grim reality of life in the Antarctic. My aim had been to photograph the interiors in an informative documentary style, but my eye was drawn to these objects to take photographs that reflected my uneasy relationship with these interiors. Each hut has its own stories of tragedy and bravery, but none more so than Scott's hut. In 1911, 10 years after the men first set foot on the ice, Scott wintered over in the Antarctic while planning his ill-fated attempt to be the first to reach the geographic South Pole. On that journey, struggling to use their dog and pony teams effectively, the expedition was reduced to man-hauling the cumbersome sleds themselves. For hundreds of kilometres, in appalling conditions, with meagre supplies and temperatures as low as minus 40 degrees centigrade. When Scott and his 4 companions finally reached the South Pole, it was to learn that the Norwegian Roald Amundsen had beaten them by 34 days. Scott and his men all tragically perished on the return journey. The knowledge of the tragic outcome of Scott's expedition and the extreme levels of bravery and sacrifice they needed to survive are ever present in the huts. In all their gloom, their intimacy, and their stillness, I offer my photographs as a record of something special and lasting that took place over 100 years ago in the Antarctic.